Aloha and welcome everyone here at the East-West Center, online and in person. Welcome to our new series, the East-West Center Research Speaker Series. Today's event is entitled Bending the Architecture, the Role of Asia in a Reformed G7, featuring Dr. Victor Cha. Really thank you for taking the time out today. And if any of your friends miss out today, know that this talk is being recorded and will be posted on the East-West Center's YouTube channel. My name is Suzanne Varislam. I'm the president of the East-West Center, and it is my distinct honor today to introduce our special speaker, Dr. Victor Cha. He is a distinguished university professor, DS Song KF chairholder, and professor of government in the Department of Government and School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's also the president of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And he is also the author of 7 books, including the award-winning Alignment Despite Antagonism, United States, Korea, Japan Security Triangle. And his most recent book, one of my favorites that I own, is Korea, A New History of South and North. And we're excited about his forthcoming book, The Black Box: Methods and Data in the Study of Korean Unification in North Korea. You know, he was appointed in 2021 by the president to serve on the Defense Policy Board in an advisory role to the Secretary of Defense. Not surprising, given his background. He formerly served on the White House National Security Council, where he was responsible primarily for Japan, the Korean Peninsula, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Island nations' affairs. Dr. Cha was also the deputy head of delegation for the United States at the Six-Party Talks in Beijing. And in 2023, he was named Distinguished University Professor, the highest honor bestowed upon a tenured faculty member at Georgetown. He has a long list, and we would be here all day because of his distinguished accomplishments. But I got to mention one thing that I found very interesting. According to Scholar GPS 2022, yes, Dr. Victor Cha is the highest ranked living political scientist with Korea expertise in the world based on publication record, citation count, and impact. But more importantly than that, he is an alumni of the East-West Center. Let's have a round for that. He is also a senior adjunct fellow of the East-West Center, and we're so proud to call him that and proud to have him here today. And with that, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Victor Cha.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Susie, for that really kind introduction. It's always good to be back at the East-West Center. I've spent many a summer month here down the hallway from Denny Roy and working on different projects. And so it really does feel like coming home. So thank you so much for having me here today. It's good to see you all in the audience, and thank you for those who are watching online as well. So really, it's a joy. It's really a pleasure to be here. If I could give presentations every week at the East-West Center and just stay here all the time, I'd do it. So in a heartbeat. But so I think, you know, as I often do, when I come by, I like to share some of the work and research that I've been doing over the past couple of months, in this case, the past 3 or 4 months, for your interest and also any feedback that you might have. And this particular project is one that we have been working on at CSIS, as Susie said, where I hang one of my hats, and it's really been on this question of the future of the G7, the group of 7. And what sparked this particular project was, I think it comes as a surprise to no one that sort of the rules and norms of the international order today are under a great deal of stress, right? We're in the middle of 2 wars. right, in Europe and in the Middle East. The UN Security Council is stymied because of two particular actors, two particular permanent members, right, China and Russia. There's a lot of economic coercion that's taking place around the world, weaponizing of economic interdependence. Lots of concerns about China's trajectory, lots of concerns about North Korea's nuclear program. So there are a lot of things that are stressing the rules-based international order, and arguably our traditional institutions of global governance are underperforming, right? So as I mentioned, if you look at the UN Security Council today cannot even issue a presidential statement when North Korea fires a ballistic missile, let alone getting all members to comply with the 11 sanctions that currently exist on North Korea. The UN Security Council today, because of Chinese and Russian opposition, can't even issue a statement, right, when North Korea flies another ballistic missile. The G20, the Group of 20, another big global governance institution, had very high expectations at the time that it was formed, at the time of the financial crisis, but unfortunately now is less effective in terms of issues of global governance. The BRICS, right, is another institution of global governance, an important group, but one that has a lot of countries in it that are not like-minded. Right? Russia, China, Iran, for example, are all in the BRICS. And that makes it hard for that to act as a institution of global governance. The World Trade Organization now has, I think, 160 members in it. And it is not exactly a group with which you can build consensus, right, with such a large number. And as I said, meanwhile, while these institutions are really facing challenges in terms of moving forward with their mission. Meanwhile, we have wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, China becoming more assertive, North Korea, Hamas, like the list goes on and on. But the problem of global governance is not just about the bad things that are happening. There are lots of good, new, and different things that are happening around the world. Unprecedented advances in artificial intelligence, in health sciences, in supply chains, in all of these sorts of areas that are opportunities, right? These are opportunities that mandate sort of new rules, right? New norms, new ways of working together, new ways of cooperating together. But there isn't an institution that right now that exists to do this, right, to sort of fill that gap. And that is where this project that we're working on comes in. So the premise of the project is basically that the G7 has emerged as more important than ever as the only viable institution of global governance among like-minded partners. Okay? For those of you who have not worked on the G7 before, right? The G7 are the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and then the European Union and the European Council also have seats in the G7. Did I cover everybody? Did I get everybody? I think I got them all, right? I think I got them all. And so we are seeing increasingly when Secretary Blinken is speaking, or the Foreign Minister of the United Kingdom, or the Foreign Minister of Germany, there's constant reference to the G7. Right? There's constant reference to the G7. There was just a G7 meeting in Italy in June. And so the premise of the project is that, in the midst of a lot of disorder and a lot of concerns about global governance, things are gravitating towards the G7 as becoming sort of this de facto institution of global governance. Now, I should say that to define what we mean by institution of global governance, when we talk about the G7 as an institution of global governance, we're not saying it's replacing the UN Security Council. Right? It's not replacing the UN Security Council. Your UN Security Council, if they can agree, right, they make resolutions, they can issue mandates that UN member states are obligated to comply with. Right? So the G7 doesn't have that sort of capacity, and no one is expecting the G7 to have that sort of capacity. However, the G7, as this group of advanced industrialized democracies, can talk about coordinating policies. Right? They can talk about setting rules with regard to artificial or the military use of artificial intelligence. Right? They can sort of coordinate rules and norms and practices that can help lay a path for other countries to follow. Right? That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about a new UN Security Council. So just by way of background, this problem is not, I'm not the only one who's identified this problem. In a recent issue of Foreign Affairs, Andrew Kendall Taylor and Richard Fontaine have talked about the vacuum in global governance to contend with a world that's falling into blocks. In particular, they focus on the bloc of China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. The liberal institutionalist Professor John Eikenberry, in a foreign policy piece last year, also talked about how time and again the United States and liberal democracies in Europe and Asia have found themselves in a struggle for defining world order, and that this time the burden, the onus is falling on the G7 as the only viable grouping to do this. And I think that's good and that's all important. But the issue, I think, is that to fulfill this role or this mandate, the G7 of today needs to be reimagined. In other words, the G7 of today is certainly playing a very important role, but it needs to be reimagined. We have to start thinking about what the future of the G7 should look like. The G7 started out in the 1970s as an informal club of advanced industrialized democracies that largely were coordinating monetary policy in response to the oil shock. Right? That's how it started out. And the G7 has evolved over time. It has changed over time. One of the biggest changes was when it became the G8. You'll remember in 1998, Russia was added to the G7 to become the G8. And then some of you may remember that it went back to becoming the G7 in 2014 when an emergency session of the G8 was organized in which they all agreed that Russia should be taken out of the G8. Now, again, the G7. And as I mentioned, now it's this grouping of advanced industrialized democracies, the US, Europe, the Americas, Europe, and Japan. But here's the issue. The G7 needs to play this global governance role, and the G7 actually wants to play this global governance role. So it's going to be hard for people. Maybe people who are watching online can see this better than folks in the audience. But if we actually look at the issues that the G7 has considered important to the leaders, if you look at the leaders' summits, the G7 leaders' summit statements, the types of issues that G7 leaders have talked about increasingly have taken on a global focus. So it's not just about coordinating monetary policy, but it's a whole list of things starting from like Ukraine to food security, to non-proliferation, to digital competitiveness, climate change, right? The list is increasingly global, right? So it's not simply an academic like me saying the G7 needs to fill this global governance vacuum. If you actually look at what the G7 leaders are talking about, they're talking about what the priority issues that they want to coordinate on policy on are all now global, right? So the G7 wants to play this global governance role, and where really the watershed for this was last year in 2023 in Hiroshima, when Japan hosted the G7 summit, where they laid out a wide range of global issues as the G7 mandate, right? So it's not just me saying they should play this role. G7 leaders themselves are acknowledging the fact that the G7 role must be larger and global. But the dilemma is that the G7, what's that commercial? It's this is not your grandfather's Oldsmobile, right? The G7 of today is not really equipped to do the job that the G7 wants to do, right? As enumerated in Hiroshima, for example. So if you go backwards to the previous slide, right? In 1992, the G7 represented almost 70% of global GDP, right? When in the 1990s. By 2012, this dropped below 50% by 2012, and today it's 43%. Also today, G7 members represent less than 10% of the global population. Right? So on the one hand, the G7 wants to play this role as a global governance institution. On the other hand, the way it's currently equipped, it can't really play that role, right? Because it represents a small, and it represents none of the global south, right? There's one country that represents all of the Indo-Pacific, right? It's not equipped to play this role. So this research project really tried to take on this challenge. But it took on the challenge with the understanding that despite the real need for an institution of global governance, there is really no time or capacity to create a new institution. We're not back in 1945 where we can decide to create a new institution. No one has the time, the resources, or the ability to do this. But what we can do is instead of creating new institutions, we can try to bend existing institutions to meet this challenge, right? So we did a series of meetings about these topics back in DC, and the term bending the architecture, I'm actually borrowing from Deputy Secretary Kurt Campbell, who joined us for one of these meetings and gave a speech in which he talked about the notion of bending the architecture. So he and I have known each other for a long time. We often trade jabs about who coined the phrase first. This one I'm completely giving to him, right? He coined this phrase first, bending the architecture. So there's really no time to create a new architecture, but we can try to bend existing architecture to meet the challenge. And this is where the G7 fits in. Right? There is no other group of like-minded countries out there that can play this role, that can support the rules-based international order, that can define rules and norms in uncharted areas like ethics of AI use, things of this nature. So in this work that we've been doing, we talk about 3 changes that are needed for the G7. I'll start with the first and the one that gets the most attention and arguably is also the most controversial, and that is that the G7 needs to expand its membership, right, in order to have the capabilities to be effective. So if we go forward one slide again. So again, to go back to this slide, what we did here basically was we looked at G7 leader statements 2018 to 2023. This does not include the last G7 summit in Italy in June. But we looked at G7 leader statements 2018 to 2023, did a text analysis of those leader statements to try to understand what sort of issues emerge over time in terms of what G7 leaders focus on, right? And so this gives us a sense of what the G7 leaders see as their mandate, and what they want to focus on. And so you can see here over time, if you go to I think the next slide will be clearer, right? These were sort of the top issues. If we look over time between 2018 and 2023, what G7 leaders focus on, and this is pretty much in order in terms of strength of emphasis, right? How much they emphasize this. Future of the Indo-Pacific, economic resilience and economic security, food security, digital competitiveness, climate change, the war in Ukraine, global economy, finance, and sustainable development, disarmament and non-proliferation, and labor. Right? These were sort of the issues. So we did a text analysis to sort of pull out the frequency of these mentions in them. And this is what came up. And then what we did was we took these issues, and then looked at a data set of 300 plus publicly available performance metrics for countries in these issues. Right? So this is all publicly available data, where different organizations have sort of ranked how countries perform in these sorts of issue areas. Right? And so if you go to the next slide. So what we found when we did this performance ranking is that G7, there are G7 countries, we did them for G7 countries, but there were two countries in particular in terms of these performance rankings that were in the middle of it, in some cases doing better than existing G7 countries. Right? And the two countries were, you can see Australia, right, and South Korea were two countries that on all of these, when we looked at overall metrics, they were performing as well as, if not better, than some G7 members. If you go to the next slide, which will be very, very difficult for people to see. So the slide before was the aggregate ranking. So and this is broken down by the issue areas. So we did a total ranking, and then you can break these down in each of these issue areas. And so you can see, for example, on economic resilience and economic security, Australia's performance is ranked higher than all G7 members except three, except the US, the UK, and Germany. On digital competitiveness, South Korea is currently performing better than every G7 member except the US and the UK. So the point of all this is that, on these key global issues that have been defined and really sort of featured at the 2023 Hiroshima summit that the G7 leaders want to work on, there are members with key capabilities in these defined issue areas that sit outside the group, right? And there is an argument then for bringing them in. But so this is just the data-based argument because we want to try to bring data to a policy argument. But there were also other arguments for bringing Australia and South Korea in the G7. They are currently the 12th and the 13th largest economies in the world. And so if you take out some of the other economies that are up there, like China, Brazil, and others, 12th, and plus you already have the G7, 12th and 13th is pretty high up there. Right? It's pretty high up there. The other important thing to remember is that adding members like Australia and Korea can improve the effectiveness of the group while not reducing the level of informality. And so what I mean by that is, as part of this project, we brought together about 24 former G7 Sherpas, Sioux Sherpas, and Yaks, which are names that they use for G7 point people. So we brought together about 24 of them from the Biden, Trump, Obama, and George W. Bush administrations, as well as diplomats from G7 countries in DC, diplomats from G7 countries in DC. And one of the things that became very clear when we talked to the G7 Sherpas is they really value the informality of the G7, right? They really value the informality of a smaller group of leaders that could get together, that didn't need to use talking points, that could have real conversations with each other around the table. They compared it to like the G20 Leaders Summit, where G20 Leaders Summit, everybody comes in, they have their talking points, they give their talking points. It's not as intimate. Like the G7 is an intimate group, it's informal, leaders can talk about how they need to coordinate policy. And so actually many of the Sherpas we talked to were actually resistant to expanding the G7 because they feel like they'd lose some of the informality and also lose some of the effectiveness. They think actually because the G7 is small and informal, it's more effective, right? And the argument that we try to make in this work is totally understand that, totally get that, right? Sometimes small, informal, trusted groups can work better and be more effective together. But it's not you don't hit that diminishing returns by adding one or two people, right? You can add one or two more members and both remain informal and increase effectiveness, right? So you don't necessarily lose that. If you add 10, you lose it. But if you add one or two, maybe you don't really lose that. And so the notion of adding Sherpas like small, informal, and effective, but the notion of optimizing size and effect is still possible, by adding just one or two new members that really have capabilities to bring to it. Also of importance and note is that in the current G7, like if you go back, if you could go back one more, right? If you go back, so if you look at the text analysis, the number one issue that has increased in prominence in G7 leader statements is the Indo-Pacific. Like in 2018, barely mentioned. 2023, most mentioned. I mean, one of the most mentioned issues, the future of the Indo-Pacific. Well, if that's the case, if G7 leaders believe that that is one of the most important things that G7 leaders should talk about, the current G7 makeup has only one country that represents all of the Indo-Pacific. Right? And so the addition of Korea and Australia makes sense, right? If the Indo-Pacific if G7 leaders really see the future of the Indo-Pacific as important to the G7 countries. Another thing that G7 Sherpas also focused on as being important is this notion of trust. Right? G7 leaders can trust each other, they can rely on each other. Australia and South Korea have a pretty strong record in terms of engendering trust among advanced industrialized democracies. Australia and South Korea are two US allies that have fought in every war. For Australia since World War I, for South Korea since the Korean War. They are very vested in providing public goods to the international system. So if you go ahead one more slide, right here. Yeah, again, sorry, these are small. This is just a list of within really since 2023, there are a couple of 2022, all the different issue areas in which Australia and South Korea have proven themselves to be public goods providers. So whether you're talking about the World Health Summit, the Indian Ocean Conference, the Forum on Nuclear Risk Reduction, the REAIM Summit, Responsible AI in the Military Domain, ODA International Conference, these two countries have really proven themselves to be public goods providers. And so this would make the group larger. It would balance it out more by adding more Indo-Pacific voices to the group that has been predominantly European. In addition to that, we think that the European Commission and the European Council seats should be merged right there. So the G7 is actually the G9 because the European Commission and the European Council get 2 additional seats. And so those 2 should be merged into 1, and then you'd add Australia and South Korea. So you're only netting an additional country. In the analysis that we've done, there were other European countries also that did quite well. So Spain actually did quite well, as did the Netherlands in terms of the performance metrics. But that's just that's neither here nor there. So that's sort of the one, and I think the biggest reform that we talked about. If we could go to the next slide. Yes, okay. And the second reform relates to the Global South. So when we talk to G7 Sherpas, former Sherpas, they are very self-conscious about the legitimacy of the G7 in the eyes of the Global South and middle and emerging and middle economies, right? And in the fact that Global South and middle and emerging economies don't really have a voice in the G7. G7 is very conscious of this. That's when you talk to Sherpas, that's all they talk about is that. And so the other recommendation that we make is the G7, in order to fulfill this role of global governance, needs to create some sort of formal consultation mechanism with other key constituencies in the Global South and among critical and emerging, middle and emerging economies. The G7 does this informally now. Everything is informal. They do it informally. But we advocate that there should be a formal tie, a formal consultation mechanism between the G7 before and after the leaders' summits with key constituencies. And those key constituencies should be the African Union, ASEAN, China, the OIC, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, and the G20 at a minimum. There should be formal consultation mechanisms with all of those groups. And then the third reform relates to G7 agenda setting, and this is starting to get much more into the weeds. Right now, the G7 agenda is entirely determined by the host country. So whoever hosts the G7 summit determines the agenda. So in 2023 in Hiroshima, Japan had control of the agenda. This year in Puglia in Italy, Italy had control. Next year, it'll be Canada, right? Canada will have control. When we asked the G7 Sherpas, why does it work like this? They said, well, you know, it's very informal, and when you host, you have to pay for everything. So we think that we should let, it's like if they're paying for the dinner, they should be able to have some say over what's going on. And that sounds very nice and very, very civilized, but it can also lead to inefficiencies, right? It can also lead to inefficiencies. So just to give you a small example of this, at the Hiroshima summit in 2023, one issue area that was highlighted quite importantly was economic security, right, with regard to economic coercion, weaponization of trade, and interdependence. Italy then hosted the summit this year. Their focus was largely on migration, right, from North Africa. And economic security was there, but didn't figure very prominently, right? Yet economic security, organizing to prevent economic coercion, is not just a one-year project, right? This is a project that goes on and on. So at our meeting, the Canadian official who was there raised their hand and they said, oh, don't worry, we're hosting the G7 next year and we will talk about economic security. And we were like, that's our point, right? It's not something that should disappear when one host focuses on something else and then reappear when another host thinks it's important. So, but at the same time, G7 Sherpas, they really don't like a formal secretariat, anything like that. So our recommendation, you know, acknowledging what G7 leaders, G7 Sherpas think was important, is that we advocated for a formal agenda setting process that involved a troika of, in this case, Japan, Italy, and Canada, right? So for this year's summit, if the troika was operative, then the previous year's summit host, the current year's and next year's would together form the agenda for the G7 summit, and that would change obviously every year depending on. So next year it would be Italy, Canada, and whoever comes after that. I can't remember who comes after that. So that gets a little bit into the weeds, but anyway, just to conclude, so we're at this. What motivates this research is we're at this watershed point in history, where a combination of all these sorts of things, conflict, the changing power dynamics, block of autocracies, all these sorts of things are challenging the rules-based order like never before. And our global institutions are not working. We do not have time to create new institutions, so we need to bend existing ones to meet the challenge. And the G7 leaders are already gravitating in this direction, seems to be the best place where we can bend the architecture to meet these new challenges. So thank you very much for listening, for those online as well, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you. Oh, thanks. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Victor, or Dr. Cha.
Victor.
Victor. Okay, I'll call you Victor. That was a victory. I appreciate you making the case, using data, giving us a little history lesson, sharing with us why this idea of expanding the G7 is so important with Australia and Korea. And clearly, by showing the different conditions, I don't think that data, when we look at 1992, I believe, at the high point of GDP, not a real change in population, but the GDP at 40 plus percent now, today, certainly a big change.
Yes, big change.
And then the performance of Australia and the history of the performance and history of both Australia and Korea, so different today.
Yeah.
And then some of these facts that you brought up that I don't think we really think about in terms of the agenda setting. Most people, unless you're in this policy world, you don't realize how that's made. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have continuity and the long game or the long look, it's very difficult to realize change.
That's right.
We know that. And so you definitely make that case. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions I have, but I do want to give the audience here in person a chance to ask some questions, as well as those online. Thank you for those of you who joined us online. What I'm going to ask is we're going to first take any questions from the audience in here. And if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you. And I ask that you just ask the question. Sometimes we want to provide enough time for everyone to get a question. And, sometimes people use it an opportunity to message. So if we could just ask the question. And then we will go online, and Dr. Denny Roy here is moderating those questions that are coming in online for us. So, and if you could state your name and where you're from, and then also your question. So we'll start here.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Chan, and it's wonderful giving us an insight regarding to your knowledge and your background. It's just that a question is, I know that you specialize in the six-party talks. You think that with the situation with North Korea and South Korea, they should restart the six-party talks again? Maybe include like Russia, not Russia, but Australia, Canada, India involved, because they kind of play a major role in the Indo-Pacific region. And also my other question is that the G7, you mentioned about having Indo-Pacific. I know that G7 committees are mostly the West, English-speaking country and more of democratic nations besides Germany and Japan. So if you look at the big five eyes, they're influencing the democratic countries. So basically, do you think that the G7 can have more expansion in those kind of ways?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. So on the first question, when we engaged in the six-party talks, it was a very different time, right? With regard to China, we were fully in a policy framework and a policy template that I think former Deputy Secretary of State, former World Bank President Bob Zoellick called the responsible stakeholder template. The idea being that the United States and China could work together on issues around the world, and that it would be part of China's responsibility as it grew in power to be a responsible stakeholder. And the six-party talks in many ways was a project for that. Of course, it was to try to denuclearize North Korea, but it was a big project in U.S.-China relations to see if they could work together. And in that regard, it was successful. I mean, as I said earlier, there are 11 UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea's nuclear weapons that could not have been possible if China didn't sign them, and Russia. They both signed them. Today, we're in a very different situation, right? China and Russia both oppose any new UN actions on North Korea. Not only that, Russia is actively trying to dismantle the UN sanctions regime on North Korea. Right? They vetoed the renewal of UN Security Council resolution, forgetting the number now, in my old age, I can't remember the exact number resolution, but it's the one that would reauthorize the panel of experts, right? The body in the UN that monitors sanctions compliance, North Korea. So they vetoed that resolution. The panel of experts is gone. It's disappeared. So we're in a very different time now, where if we were to convene the six-party talks, I doubt that China and Russia would be interested in doing the things that they were doing 20 years ago in terms of supporting UN Security Council resolutions, actively trying to persuade North Korea to give up their weapons. You know, how we got to this place as opposed to 20 years ago, that's an entirely different discussion, but I think it's hard to imagine pulling together the six countries right now. On the G7, as I said, we did, and on expanding it in terms of other membership, I think there's general agreement among the former Sherpas that this group needs to be rebalanced. I mean, it is predominantly Europe, one Indo-Pacific country, and then a couple of countries from the Western Hemisphere. But again, the agenda, as we saw the G7, is global now. So this is a mismatch, right? And so I think there's sympathy to that argument, but you know, there still is. I mean, just in case any of the former Sherpas are watching online, I don't want them to think I'm misrepresenting. You know, there is still substantial resistance among former Sherpas to changing the composition of the G7, because I think it's in part because when they were all Sherpas, they thought they did a good job, and I'm sure they did do a good job. But our point in this research is that when they were Sherpas, the world was a different place. And where we are today is very different from where we were 10 years ago. And so institutions need to change and adapt. When the external environment changes, institutions need to change and adapt.
Thanks for that, Victor. It makes me think of when we do have to change with the environment, it doesn't mean anything about the wonderful work that was done and that exactly resistance that happens. And that really we're building on those successes by adapting and changing just as they did in the past. So you continue to make the case about why we need to look at expanding the membership of the G7. So thank you for the question and thank you for the answer. We'll shift now online. Denny?
Is the Israel-Gaza war under discussed within the G7? Does this indicate a blind spot for the G7 on this issue that might have carried over to this issue being underrepresented in your analysis?
the only thing I can say in response to that is when we collected the data, what issues were being discussed among G7 leaders. Ukraine was up there, but the war in the Middle East was not. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think they talked about it. I'm sure they talked quite a bit about it. And of course, the future of the Indo-Pacific has been around as an issue much longer than the war in the Middle East. So this could change, certainly. I mean, we could certainly see in Canada or in the summit that follows Canada, much more discussion of this. It is a global issue, so I could not imagine G7 leaders are not talking about it. I don't think they agree on it. I think the question suggests that G7 leaders, this is one area where there isn't a lot of agreement. But I don't think that means it was under discussed.
Thanks for that. We'll shift again to in the room. Any more in the room?
Thanks. So I was part of the embassy team from Embassy Tokyo in Hiroshima in May of 2023. The memories are flooding back as you're speaking about it. But my question is, when it comes to moving forward with the recommendations, and once there is a consensus that this might be the way to go, what is the mechanism to actually expand the membership? Is it a vote amongst the G7? Is it consensus all the way around? And then also regarding some of your other recommendations too, like how does it actually get implemented for everybody to agree to move forward?
Yeah. So thank you for the question. So I, did not do a lot of research on the G7 before we started this project. But as I did, I really became quite fascinated at how this was such a prominent institution, and yet it was so informal. Right? Normally, when we think about institutions in international relations, they're all quite formal. They have rules, they have bylaws, they have all these sorts of things. But this is a group of the top advanced industrialized democracies in the world. And they do everything informally. Like everything is informal. So I would imagine if they want to make a decision on expanding membership, it would probably be the host country for that year that would say, I want to put this on the agenda. And then they would have to reach some sort of consensus. I don't even think they do a formal vote. They probably reach some sort of consensus and invite these other countries to join. The same thing with regard to the other sort of more in the weeds recommendations that we made. With regard to the Global South, the G7 does reach out to Global South countries, but it's all done very informally. I don't know how it was done at Hiroshima, but it was all done. And I guess that means sometimes it can be done and sometimes it won't be done. And so our point was, if they want to take seriously the notion that they want to be inclusive in terms of getting the views of emerging and middle economies in the Global South, as they think about these global issues, then they need to set up a formal mechanism both before and then after the summit. And so I imagine these sorts of things, again, it would depend on the host country, the way it's set up now, and the host country would have to make some sort of recommendation, put it on the agenda, and they discuss it. So
then the follow-on is, do you think that there would be a champion among the current G7 that would want to take this up?
Yes, I do. Yes.
The question is, do you think there would be a champion?
Yes, I think there would. I think there are, at least based on sort of my interaction, I think there would be a few. I think the United States, although that is not officially in any of your instructions or talking points, my feeling is that the United States would support it. We actually did a panel on this in Korea, and a UK official was on the panel, and he did not have instructions, but he said he would support it, right? So I think there are a few countries that would support expansion. My sort of straw poll view on this is I think the United States, the UK, I think Germany is open to it. France is France. You never know. They're too busy with the Olympics right now. I would say, frankly, like Japan is not in favor of it. But things can change. We never know. Like things can change. But I agree. I agree with you. What's suggesting in question is that it does require a champion. It does require one or two countries to really say, we really want this to happen for the future of the G7. And then it's their job to bring the other members around. So, yeah.
Thanks for the question and thanks for that answer. It makes me wonder if the informality of the sessions either lend itself to perhaps change or not. You know, does it help or hurt? So I wonder about that as well. But let's go back online.
Still waiting for one, but I'll ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
I understand there's a tension between increasing the numbers and maintaining the sort of culture of the organization. I think that tension would be minimized if the new members were countries that would naturally accord to the original culture of the organization. So having said that, how about adding New Zealand along with South Korea and Australia?
Yeah. So one of the things that, thanks, Danny, for the question. So one of the things that we really tried to do with this project is, you know, so there like, there are a million think tanks in DC that can give you 2 million policy recommendations. But what we really tried to do was bring policy recommendations that were backed by the data, right? And so that's why we did the performance metrics first before we knew which countries should be to consider adding. Right? And so when we did it, the countries that really sort of showed up were, again, Australia, South Korea, Spain, and the Netherlands sort of really showed up. I cannot remember where New Zealand is in that, but I don't think it was very high in terms of the performance metrics. It certainly meets the culture, if you will, of the G7, but in terms of the capabilities that it brings on the 9 issues that we talked about, they didn't score very high. The other country that always comes up, people ask about, is India, right? But in terms of all the performance metric, India was consistently below. So the lowest performing country consistently, I mean, no offense to anybody here, but the lowest country performing consistently was Italy, right? Of the G7 members, they had the lowest performance metric. India was consistently below Italy, right? Consistently below Italy. We looked at it really in terms of what does the data show us. And in initial iterations of this, we did talk about Spain in particular as another country because Spain does bring something that's different to the G7. It's the link to the Western Hemisphere. It's also a G20 country, right? So there's connections there. But then there were this whole question of now you're bringing in, you're advocating for way too many. Also, there are plenty of Europeans already there, so why do you want more Europeans? So I think in the report that we did, we recognized Netherlands and Spain as possible other members in the future, depending on the direction in which membership expansion goes.
Thank you for that, for sharing about the metrics really driving the recommendations based on the data. So we have Ned back there.
Thanks, Victor. And my name is Ned Schultz. I'm a former East West Center grantee. What happens when the basic structure gets challenged? In other words, you seem to have developed a pretty good sense of consensus among these nations. But let's say we have a maverick leader who becomes the leader of one of these G7s, and they start to challenge it and say, no, we don't need this. We don't want to deal with you guys. So what do you do?
I can't imagine what leader you're talking about. But you know, it's a very fair question. And again, in the research and in talking to former Sherpas and everything, they didn't discount that. I mean, on the one hand, many of them were resistant to change, but on the other hand, they acknowledged that leaders change and they can take countries in very different directions, including our own. And so, well, I mean, look at Russia, right? Russia was in and then it was out. So nobody denied that that could happen. Right? But there's an interesting thing about the way the United States thinks about this. Whether you're talking about future Harris or Trump administration, that I'd be happy to talk about offline, but I'm not going to talk about it online. But I would just say that in general, we found that in the United States, the U.S. government, there was actually quite a bit of support for the idea conceptually in either instance.
Great, thank you for that. And we did have we have time for one more question, and then we're going to close it. We had in the back there one more question.
Thank you. Jiyoung Lee, I'm a postgrad visiting fellow here at the East West Center. My question actually speaks to some of the earlier questions. Based on your findings, and then you think about the U.S. strategy towards the Indo-Pacific, I wonder the expansion of G7, do you see a lot of convergence? In other words, that will serve U.S. pursuing and implementing the goals that it has when we think about U.S.-Asia strategy. Because Australia and South Korea are key treaty allies of the United States. And these days, you think about Camp David Summit and the agenda and the things that they agree on. And as allies, what they want to do, I think, at least in my mind, although I don't specialize in the G7 and institutions, I think there's some important overlaps in terms of agenda, just in terms of trying to navigate these, huge uncertainties that are at the global level. So
Yeah. So I would say that thinking about it in those terms, there's more overlap between U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and the NATO AP4, right? So the other thing that we're seeing happening is that we've now had, 2 or 3 successive NATO meetings in which the so-called AP4, the Asia-Pacific 4, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, are now regular sort of participants in the NATO summit. Happened in Washington just last month in Washington. When I talk to folks in the U.S. government, they see that as a permanent thing, a permanent fixture. Not that they become a part of NATO, but they are invited to NATO summit meetings going forward. So I think and that's all about security, right? So there, I think we're seeing more of an overlap between U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, European Indo-Pacific strategy, and the NATO AP4, right? I mean, if there is one single event that has brought together the Europe and Indo-Pacific security theaters, it's been the war in Ukraine, right? It has really brought them together. One of the most obvious reasons and direct connections being North Korea's supply of ammunition to Russia for the war in Ukraine, and then what Russia may be providing to North Korea in terms of their WMD program in Asia, right? So even before this, the rise of China, Taiwan Straits, TSMC has brought the Europeans and the Americans together, but now the North Korea piece has really brought them together. I think the G7 expansion idea it's related to, but I see it as sort of separate from that because it's not an idea. It could be an idea that comes from the United States, but it doesn't have to come from the United States. It could come from Canada. It could come from Germany. It could come from others. And it really is about global governance. It's not just about U.S.-China competition, but it really is about, or U.S.-Russia competition. It's really about global governance. And so I think that's a little bit separate from Indo-Pacific strategy.
Thank you so much for that question. And we are at time. Victor, I really want to thank you for bending our minds. I mean, you really have. Yes, so please a round of applause for Victor. I mean, very insightful and This will be available on our website again to share, to review, because you certainly gave us so much to think about. I think it's not something that we have been thinking about or discussing. So really, really thank you for really fostering this dialogue that I think needs to happen. And I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us online and in person today. Thank you again, Victor. Thank you all again. Aloha.